She was the CEO's daughter, powerful, wealthy, and destined to inherit it all. But when whispers of corruption and discrimination spread through her father's company, she made a bold move. Ditching her privilege, she went undercover as a janitor, and what she uncovered: shocking, humiliating, infuriating. But the real twist? They never saw it coming, until she revealed who she really was. Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. The heavy glass doors of Carter Enterprises gleamed under the late morning sun, reflecting the towering skyline of Manhattan. The building stood like a fortress, its steel and glass facade exuding power and exclusivity. Sophia Carter had walked through those doors countless times before, but never like this. Today, she wasn't Sophia Carter, heiress to one of the most influential corporate empires in the country. She was Sophie Martin, an anonymous new hire on the janitorial staff. She adjusted the plain gray uniform that felt foreign against her skin. It was stiff, slightly oversized, a far cry from the tailored business attire she was used to. The ID badge clipped to her shirt bore a fake name, a false history, carefully constructed so no one would question her presence. As she stepped inside, the air-conditioned lobby enveloped her in an unnatural chill. She had been in this building since she was a child, sitting in her father's office while he ran meetings with his executives. She knew every inch of it: the executive floor, the boardroom, the private elevators that only senior staff could access. But this, the service entrance, the cramped locker rooms, the back hallways, these were entirely new to her. The decision to do this hadn't come lightly. For months, she had heard murmurs, whispers of unfair treatment, of power-hungry executives who ruled through intimidation rather than leadership. Employees spoke in hushed tones about the way lower-level staff were discarded like broken machinery, especially those in maintenance and janitorial roles. She had brought these concerns to her father, Jonathan Carter, expecting him to take immediate action. Instead, he had leaned back in his chair, studying her with his sharp, assessing gaze. "If you really want to understand how this company works," he had said, "start at the bottom." At first, she thought he was joking. But as he laid out his challenge, to experience the company not as an heiress, but as an ordinary worker, it became clear he was testing her. He wanted to see if she had the resilience, the determination to lead beyond a title. And so, here she was. The break room for janitorial staff was nothing like the polished lounges on the executive floors. It was small, tucked away near the back of the building, with fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. A few plastic chairs were scattered around a battered table, and a vending machine hummed in the corner. Maria Gomez, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, handed Sophia a mop and a small cleaning cart. "You're new, right, Sophie, was it?" Sophia nodded. "Yeah, first day." Maria looked her up and down, then sighed. "Stick with me, stay out of trouble, and don't let the suits walk all over you." The first few hours passed uneventfully. Sophia followed Maria through the hallways, wiping down surfaces, emptying trash cans, and trying to blend in. No one paid her much attention, until she reached the executive floor. Here, the air changed. It was crisper, colder. The offices were lined with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering breathtaking views of the city. The contrast between this space and where she had just been was staggering. She was cleaning a conference room when she heard raised voices from down the hall. A middle-aged janitor stood near the coffee station, his head slightly bowed as a sharply dressed man berated him. "Are you completely useless?" The man's voice was laced with irritation. He gestured at the floor, where a coffee cup lay overturned, dark liquid seeping into the carpet. "Do you even pay attention to what you're doing?" The janitor mumbled an apology, bending down to clean the spill. "You should be grateful you even have a job here." The man sneered before turning on his heel and walking away without a second glance. Sophia clenched her jaw, her hands tightening around the rag she held. The janitor hadn't spilled the coffee. Someone else had, an executive, most likely, who had simply walked away without a care. The janitor's face was weary, resigned. He had clearly been through this before. Maria, standing beside Sophia, muttered under her breath, "That's Mark Henderson, Senior VP of Sales. Thinks he owns the place." Sophia forced herself to stay quiet, but her pulse thrummed with anger. This was exactly why she was here. And it was only her first day. The second day of work felt different. The unfamiliar weight of the janitorial uniform no longer bothered Sophia as much. But something else had started to settle in, an unease. A quiet tension that hung in the air whenever she stepped onto the executive floor. This was the heart of Carter Enterprises, where million-dollar deals were closed over morning coffee, and where the people in power rarely acknowledged those who made sure the space remained pristine. Sophia had spent years attending high-profile meetings in these very offices, sitting quietly beside her father, absorbing every lesson about leadership and corporate strategy. Yet, from where she stood now, with a mop in hand, it was clear that the true dynamics of power here had little to do with leadership and everything to do with hierarchy. She maneuvered her cart toward the main hallway, where polished marble floors stretched out in both directions. Voices echoed from inside the offices, snippets of conversations about quarterly earnings, client negotiations, and stock projections. But as she approached the break area, a different kind of conversation reached her ears. "You think she even understands English?" The voice was sharp, condescending. Sophia turned the corner just in time to see a tall man in a tailored navy suit smirking as he nudged another executive. "I don't know, Mark," the second man replied, chuckling. "Maybe she just chooses to ignore you. Smart move, if you ask me." Mark Henderson, Senior VP of Sales. He leaned lazily against the counter, arms crossed, eyes gleaming with amusement. He was in his early 40s, with the kind of confidence that came from years of unchecked arrogance. Sophia kept her expression neutral, resisting the urge to respond. She knew men like him. They thrived on power plays, testing boundaries just to see how far they could push before someone pushed back. Mark tilted his head toward her. "Hey, sweetheart, mind wiping this up?" She followed his gaze down to the floor where coffee had been spilled, fresh, still steaming, and very obviously intentional. The cup lay on its side a few feet away, a brown stain seeping into the grout between the marble tiles. She took a slow breath, crouched down, and began wiping the mess. "Wow," Mark mused, looking at his watch. "She actually listens, a rare quality these days." Laughter rippled through the small crowd that had gathered near the doorway. Lisa Monroe, the assistant to the chief operating officer, stepped forward with a smirk of her own. Lisa was in her early 30s, impeccably dressed, always carrying herself like someone far above her actual rank. People knew her not for her competence but for her ability to align herself with the right power players. "Be careful," Lisa said, her tone laced with mock concern. "Some of us have expensive shoes. Wouldn't want any of that to splash." Sophia wrung out the cloth in her hands, keeping her expression blank. "Maybe next time, try to keep the floor clean before it gets dirty," Lisa added, folding her arms. Someone else muttered, "Not sure she understands you." Lisa, more laughter. Sophia finished wiping up the coffee, then straightened, her eyes briefly locking with Lisa's. She saw the flicker of something there, something deeper than mere cruelty. It was control. Lisa enjoyed this. Before Sophia could turn away, Lisa suddenly narrowed her eyes. "Did you clean my desk this morning?" Sophia hesitated for half a second. It was enough. Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't just touch people's things without permission. My desk is organized a certain way, and I don't need you messing with it." A calculated power move. It wasn't about cleaning, it was about reminding everyone in the room that Lisa was in charge. Even over something as insignificant as this. Sophia didn't respond. Instead, she nodded once and pushed her cart toward the hallway. As she walked away, she caught sight of Ethan Brooks, standing near the copier. He was one of the few people in this department who wasn't laughing. His brow was furrowed slightly, but he remained silent. Ethan was a mid-level manager, hardworking, competent, and largely ignored by the power players because he didn't engage in their games. He wasn't an ally, not yet. But he wasn't one of them either. Sophia noted that carefully. The rest of the day followed the same pattern. She remained invisible, moving from office to office, picking up discarded coffee cups and straightening chairs that executives wouldn't bother pushing back in. But then, something unexpected happened. While wiping down a desk in an empty cubicle, she glanced at the open laptop screen still logged into an internal company email. At first, It was just idle curiosity. But then she saw the subject line. Reallocation of department funds, approval needed. She shouldn't have read further. But she did. The email was from Lisa. Sent to Mark and copied to someone in finance. The language was carefully worded. Vague enough to avoid raising suspicion. But to someone who had been raised in corporate boardrooms. The implication was clear. They were shifting funds. Large amounts. And from the phrasing, it wasn't the first time. A quiet realization settled over her. This wasn't just about arrogance or bullying. Mark and Lisa weren't just using their positions for personal amusement. They were using them for something much bigger. She logged the details in her mind. Then calmly stepped away from the desk. This was no longer just about how executives treated lower-level employees. This was about something deeper. Something far more dangerous. And she had just found the first thread to pull. The days at Carter Enterprises followed a rhythm. Mornings started with the hurried shuffle of high heels and polished dress shoes across the sleek marble floors. The executives arrived with their designer briefcases, exchanging clipped conversations about quarterly projections and market trends. By mid-morning, the coffee stations became impromptu meeting spots, filled with hushed gossip and passive-aggressive jabs masked as corporate pleasantries. And then there were the people like Sophia, except they weren't really like her. The janitorial staff, the maintenance crews, the ones who moved around unnoticed, clearing away coffee stains and empty takeout boxes left behind in meetings. They existed in the background, expected to be invisible, but Sophia was watching everything. She had spent the past few days studying Mark Henderson and Lisa Monroe, carefully noting their behaviors. It was clear they thrived on control, wielding their authority like a weapon against anyone they deemed beneath them. Mark was the dominant force, charismatic in public, ruthless in private. Lisa, on the other hand, played the role of enforcer, ensuring that his demands were met without resistance. One afternoon, while wiping down the glass walls outside a conference room, Sophia overheard two employees whispering near the elevators. "Did you hear about Russell? He's gone." "What do you mean, gone?" Mark pushed him out, said he wasn't aligned with company values. Sophia didn't react, but the words stuck with her. Later that evening, in the janitorial break room, she found Maria Gomez sitting alone, sipping coffee from a faded ceramic mug. Maria had been at Carter Enterprises for over 20 years, long enough to have seen the company evolve. Sophia hesitated for a moment before sitting across from her. "Do people get fired like that a lot?" Maria glanced at her over the rim of her mug, eyes sharp. "You ask a lot of questions for a new hire." Sophia shrugged, keeping her voice casual. "Just trying to understand how things work around here." Maria exhaled slowly. "It happens more than you think. People disappear overnight. They call it restructuring, budget cuts, whatever sounds professional. But the truth is, if you don't play by Mark's rules, you don't last long." Sophia nodded as if she had simply been making small talk, but her mind was already racing. The next day, while dusting the edges of the executive desks, she noticed something odd. A security camera, positioned directly outside Mark's office, had been tilted slightly away from its usual angle. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but she knew enough about surveillance to recognize an intentional shift. Someone had made sure the camera wouldn't capture whatever happened right in front of Mark's door. A controlled blind spot. She stored that information away, unsure yet of what it meant, but certain it wasn't just coincidence. Later that afternoon, a commotion broke out in the sales department. Sophia, pushing her cleaning cart nearby, paused when she heard the sharp, unmistakable tone of Mark Henderson addressing someone. Jake Parker, a young analyst barely out of college, stood stiffly in front of Mark's desk. His face was pale, hands gripping the edge of a report folder. "This is unacceptable," Mark said, flipping through a printed report with exaggerated impatience. "I don't know what kind of amateur mistake this is, but I can't have my department running on garbage data." Jake swallowed hard. I can fix it. Sir, I just need to. You need to think before you hand me work like this." Mark interrupted. He leaned back, feigning disappointment. "You know, mistakes like these make people question if you're cut out for this industry." Sophia kept her gaze down, pretending to wipe the edge of a table, but her ears caught every word. Mark sighed, shaking his head. "Listen, I like to give people second chances. But when someone screws up this badly, it usually comes with consequences. Jake hesitated. What kind of consequences? Mark glanced toward the office door, as if ensuring no one else was listening. Then, in a lower voice, he said, "Look, I can keep this off your record, but you're gonna have to show me that you're serious about staying here." Jake frowned. "I don't understand." Mark smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You will, if you're smart." Sophia's grip tightened around the rag in her hand. It was vague, but the implication was clear. Jake was being extorted. She took a deep breath, reaching into the pocket of her uniform where her phone was discreetly positioned, recording every word. Mark was careful. He never outright asked for money, never said anything incriminating in a way that could be used against him. But it was obvious what he was doing, dangling Jake's job over his head like bait. The moment passed, and Jake nodded stiffly before walking out of the office, looking dazed. Sophia lingered just a second too long, enough that Mark's gaze flickered to her. "What?" he snapped. She shook her head and quickly moved away, keeping her head down, but as she exited, she noticed something else. Ethan Brooks, standing by the copier, watching. Their eyes met for just a fraction of a second before she turned away. But there was something in his gaze, something assessing. It wasn't just curiosity, it was recognition. The night had settled over the city, but inside Carter Enterprises, the fluorescent lights still flickered in the service corridors. Sophia had just finished emptying the last trash bin when she felt a presence behind her. She turned to find Ethan Brooks standing a few feet away, arms crossed, his gaze unreadable. "I don't know who you are," he said quietly, "but you're not just a janitor." Sophia's heartbeat quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. She raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. "Excuse me?" Ethan took a step closer. "I saw you earlier, when Mark was threatening Jake." He paused, eyes narrowing. "You were recording." For a split second, she considered denying it, brushing it off as a misunderstanding. But something about his stance, the quiet certainty in his voice, told her it wouldn't work. She tilted her head. "And if I was?" Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Look, I don't know what your game is. You're either a reporter, some kind of corporate spy, or," he hesitated, "something else." Sophia held his gaze, weighing her options. She couldn't reveal the truth. Not yet. But if Ethan had noticed her, others might have too. She needed to control the narrative before it spiraled out of her hands. "I'm just someone who doesn't like seeing people get screwed over," she said carefully. What Mark did today wasn't the first time, was it? Ethan studied her for a moment before shaking his head. "No, and it won't be the last." He hesitated, glancing around the hallway before lowering his voice. "Mark and Lisa, whatever you think they're up to, it's worse. They've been funneling company money into side deals, fake contracts, expense accounts that don't exist on paper. A few people have tried to speak up before, but they didn't last long." Sophia kept her expression neutral, but inside, her mind was racing. This confirmed what she had suspected. The email she had seen wasn't an isolated incident. Mark and Lisa were running something much bigger. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know what you're after, but if you dig too deep, you're gonna get yourself fired. Or worse." She met his eyes. "Then why are you telling me this?" A humorless smile crossed his face. "Because I hate watching people like them win." Sophia knew this was a risk. Ethan could be lying, setting her up, or he could be genuine, someone stuck in the system, too afraid to act alone. Either way, she needed him. "I need proof," she said, "something solid." Ethan hesitated again, then sighed. "I might know where to start. There's a department ledger, finance logs that don't match what's in the official reports. But I can't just walk in and take them." "Then I will." He blinked at her. "You really have a death wish, don't you?" Sophia smirked. "You have no idea." Ethan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Fine, I'll help, but if this goes sideways, I don't know you." "Deal." As they parted ways, Sophia felt a surge of adrenaline. She had an ally now, even if it was a reluctant one. But as she returned to the janitorial break room, Maria was waiting for her, arms crossed. "You need to be careful," Maria warned. Sophia frowned. "What do you mean?" Maria glanced toward the hallway. lowering her voice. "Mark's been asking questions about you. And he told security to check your file." A cold chill ran down Sophia's spine. Mark was onto her. Maria's face was tight with concern as she pulled Sophia aside, her voice barely above a whisper. "You need to be careful," she warned. "Mark told security to check your file." Sophia felt the weight of those words settle in her chest. She had known this moment would come eventually. But not this soon. If security dug deep enough, they would find that Sophie Martin didn't exist beyond a few fabricated records. She kept her expression neutral. "Are they looking for something specific?" Maria sighed, glancing around before answering. "No clue. But Mark doesn't ask questions unless he already suspects something." Sophia nodded, her mind already racing through possible solutions. She needed to act fast. If Mark was searching for inconsistencies, she had to make sure there were none to find. That night, she slipped into a coffee shop a few blocks from Carter Enterprises. Pulling out her phone and composing an email. It was a simple request to a contact she had, someone who specialized in making inconvenient records disappear and believable ones appear. The next morning, an update appeared in the company database. Sophie Martin now had a work history, 3 years as a janitor in a smaller firm across town. Complete with references that would hold up under scrutiny. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to muddy the trail. For now. By midday, she met Ethan in a quiet stairwell near the finance department. He handed her a slim manila folder, his expression grim. "You're not going to like what's in here," he said. Sophia flipped it open. Inside were financial statements, invoices, and transfer records. At first glance, it all seemed routine, until she noticed a series of payments that didn't match the official expense reports. Large sums had been redirected from Carter Enterprises into a private account, masked under vague operational costs. She traced a name at the bottom of one of the documents. Lisa Monroe. Sophia's stomach tightened. This was the confirmation she needed. Lisa wasn't just complicit, she was directly involved in siphoning company funds. "This account," she said, tapping the document. "Can we trace where the money is going?" Ethan hesitated. "It's routed through an offshore account. If we dig deeper, someone will notice." Sophia looked up at him. "Then we don't have time to be subtle." The next few hours passed in a blur. Ethan worked his way through internal databases while Sophia kept watch, her nerves on edge. She had started this investigation expecting corruption. But this was bigger than she had anticipated. As she exited the finance office later that evening, a strange feeling crept over her. The kind of feeling that told her she wasn't alone. She changed her route, weaving through different hallways, taking a detour through the employee cafeteria. When she finally reached the service corridor, she caught a glimpse of movement in her peripheral vision. A man in a security uniform stood near the end of the hall, holding a radio to his mouth. "She's heading toward the east exit." Sophia didn't hesitate. She ducked into a side stairwell, pressing herself against the wall, heart pounding. Security was watching her. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. Mark was tightening his grip, and she couldn't afford to make a wrong move now. When she finally made it back to the janitorial break room, she found Maria pacing. The older woman's face was pale. "What's wrong?" Sophia asked. Maria gestured toward the lockers. "Your things. Someone went through them." Sophia's stomach dropped. She rushed to her locker and yanked the door open. Her neatly folded work shirt had been disturbed, and the envelope of notes she had hidden was gone. Her mind reeled. Mark was no longer just suspicious. He was hunting her. The summons came early the next morning. Sophia had barely started her shift when one of the receptionists from the executive floor approached her in the break room. "Mark Henderson wants to see you," the woman said, barely glancing at her. Now, a few of the other janitors looked up from their coffee cups, but no one said anything. Sophia felt Maria's eyes on her as she wiped her hands on her uniform, keeping her expression neutral. "Did he say why?" she asked. The receptionist shrugged. "Didn't ask." Sophia followed her out of the room, her mind already working through the possibilities. Mark was making his move. She had expected him to try something, but not this soon. When she entered Mark's office, Lisa Monroe was already there, perched on the edge of the desk, arms crossed. Her gaze swept over Sophia, cool and assessing. Mark leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. a practiced expression of disappointment on his face. "We have a problem," he said. Sophia kept her posture relaxed. "I wouldn't know, sir. I just clean the floors." Lisa let out a quiet scoff. But Mark ignored it. "Security flagged something last night. Footage from the records room." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "Records room?" Mark nodded slowly. "Yeah, see, someone was caught snooping where they shouldn't be. And from the looks of it, that someone was you." Sophia tilted her head, feigning confusion. "That's impossible. I've never been in the records room." Mark exhaled through his nose, pushing back from his desk. "Well, security says otherwise. And I have a camera feed that proves it." Sophia knew immediately he was bluffing. If there were actual footage, he wouldn't be having this conversation. Security would have already dragged her out of the building. He was fishing, trying to shake her into a confession. She let a flicker of nervousness cross her face, just enough to seem believable. "If that's true," she said carefully, "then you should show me the footage." Mark's expression remained steady, but a faint twitch in his jaw betrayed him. Lisa leaned forward. "Are you saying you didn't do it?" Sophia turned to her. "I'm saying I'd love to see this so-called evidence." Mark's fingers drummed against his desk. A pause stretched between them before he sighed, shaking his head. "Maybe the footage isn't as clear as I thought." Sophia didn't let her relief show. "He had nothing." Mark's voice dropped into something quieter, more measured. "Let me give you some advice. This is a tough place. People who don't know their place tend to make things harder for themselves." Sophia held his gaze. "I'm just here to do my job." Mark let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Then make sure you stick to it." Sophia turned to leave, but as she reached the door, Lisa spoke up. "Oh, and Sophie?" She glanced back. Lisa smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Be careful what you get yourself into." Sophia nodded, then walked out. As soon as she was in the hallway, her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from Ethan. "They're watching you. Be careful." A second later, Maria's voice echoed the same warning. "Security's been asking about you," she said when she caught Sophia in the break room. "Not just Mark, others, too." Sophia exhaled slowly. The walls were closing in. That evening, as she left the building, she felt it again, that prickling sensation on the back of her neck. Someone was watching her. She kept walking, not looking back, but when she reached the parking garage, a figure stepped out of the shadows. John Miller. Sophia had only seen him once before, in passing. The company's chief financial officer was known for keeping a low profile, rarely engaging in the day-to-day politics of the executive team. He studied her for a moment before speaking. "I know you're not who you say you are." Sophia's fingers curled slightly at her sides. "The question is," he continued, "what is it you really want?" Sophia's breath caught for just a fraction of a second, but she forced herself to stay calm. The dim lighting of the parking garage cast sharp shadows across John Miller's face, making his expression even harder to read. He wasn't like Mark Henderson or Lisa Monroe. Those two were predictable in their arrogance. John, however, had always been an enigma, a man who operated in the background, rarely drawing attention to himself. He studied her, waiting for an answer. "You're not a janitor," he said again, this time softer, more certain. "So why are you here?" Sophia's mind raced through her options. Denying everything would be pointless. He had already made up his mind. But revealing too much could put her at even greater risk. She settled on something in between. "I'm investigating something," she admitted. "Let's just say I have a vested interest in what's happening inside this company." John tilted his head slightly, as if weighing her words. "Investigating what, exactly?" She held his gaze. "The financial discrepancies, the offshore accounts, the contracts that don't add up." His expression didn't change, but she caught the brief flicker of recognition in his eyes. He knew exactly what she was talking about. After a long pause, he exhaled and glanced around to make sure they were alone. Then he lowered his voice. "I could help you," he said, "but I need to know, how much do you have?" Sophia didn't answer immediately. She needed to test him first. Enough to know that Mark and Lisa aren't just padding their expense accounts. John let out a dry chuckle. "No, they're doing a lot more than that." Sophia stayed silent, letting him continue. "I've had my suspicions about them for a while. he admitted, but suspicions don't mean anything without proof. If they go down, they'll drag anyone they can with them. I have no intention of being collateral damage. It was a carefully worded statement. He wasn't denying his knowledge of their corruption, he was just making it clear that he wouldn't take the fall for it. You want insurance, Sophia said. John smiled slightly. You catch on fast. Sophia wasn't sure she trusted him. But she needed him. He had access to financial records that she and Ethan could never obtain on their own. If he was offering an alliance, she had to take it. I assume you know about the offshore account? John asked. Sophia nodded. It's under Lisa's control. And what you probably don't know, he continued, is that the money isn't just sitting there. It's being funneled somewhere else. If we can trace where it's going, we'll have them. Sophia frowned. Can you access it? John hesitated. I can get close. But Lisa isn't an idiot, she has safeguards. And she's not working alone. That part didn't surprise Sophia. Who's protecting her? John hesitated again, then said, someone on the board. Sophia's stomach tightened. The board of directors had the power to make or break her father's leadership. If one of them was backing Lisa, this was bigger than she had anticipated. John studied her reaction before adding, if you're serious about taking them down, you need to be careful. Because if you're not, you won't just be taking on Mark and Lisa, you'll be going against someone with real power. Sophia swallowed hard but kept her expression steady. I understand the risks. John gave her a long look before finally nodding. Then we'll be in touch. As he turned to walk away, he paused just long enough to say one last thing. If you really want to win this, watch your back. Not everyone on the board is on your father's side. Sophia stood there, her pulse pounding. If John was right, then this wasn't just about corruption. This was about betrayal, at the highest level of the company. Sophia moved quickly. Every moment that passed was another opportunity for Mark and Lisa to cover their tracks. And she couldn't afford to let them get ahead. With John Miller's intel, she and Ethan began the process of tracing the offshore account. But they needed someone with deeper access, someone who could navigate the company's internal servers without raising suspicion. That's where Ryan Carter came in. Ryan was a cybersecurity analyst in the IT department. Quiet, methodical, and always a step ahead of corporate security. He was known for fixing problems before anyone realized they existed. He wasn't related to Sophia, but the last name had still been a small risk when she first approached him. Now, in a small office tucked away from prying eyes, Ryan sat in front of a screen, fingers flying across the keyboard as he worked his way through encrypted financial logs. After several tense minutes, he let out a breath. This isn't good. Sophia and Ethan leaned in. A lot of files related to financial transfers were wiped from the system in the last 48 hours. Ryan explained, whatever Mark and Lisa were doing, they knew someone was looking, and they're trying to erase it. Sophia's stomach tightened. They were running out of time. She turned to Ethan. Did you find anything else? Ethan hesitated before nodding. I overheard Lisa talking to someone on the board. She said, and I quote, we need to handle this little problem before it spreads. Sophia's grip on the chair tightened. That problem, Ethan continued, is you. Sophia took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay composed. Mark and Lisa had already taken steps to eliminate loose ends. If they knew she was the one digging into their scheme, they wouldn't hesitate to do the same to her. A knock on the door made them all jump. Maria slipped inside, her face pale. It just happened again, she said quietly. One of the cleaning staff, Luis, was fired this morning. No warning, no explanation. He was seen talking to you yesterday. Sophia exchanged a glance with Ethan. Mark was sending a message. She turned back to Ryan. Can you recover any of the deleted files? Ryan hesitated. Maybe, but it'll take time. We don't have time, she said firmly. Copy whatever you can before they wipe the rest. Ryan nodded and got to work. While he typed, Sophia pulled out her phone. It was time to make her next move. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she needed, a journalist she had met years ago. Someone who specialized in exposing corporate corruption. She drafted a short message. I have something big. We need to talk. She was about to hit send when her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. A woman's voice, sharp and composed. spoke on the other end. Miss Carter, the CEO would like to see you. Immediately, Sophia's pulse pounded. They knew. She looked at Ethan and Ryan. I have to go. Ethan frowned. That's not a good idea. I don't have a choice. Minutes later, she stepped into the executive office. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing her inside with 4 people, her father, Jonathan Carter, sitting at his desk, and across from him, Mark, Lisa, and Richard Lawson, a senior member of the board. Her father's expression was unreadable, but his words were clear. Sophie Martin, or should I say, Sophia Carter? Sophia felt the floor drop out beneath her. She had been exposed. Sophia stood in the center of the office, her pulse steady despite the storm raging around her. The room was quiet for only a fraction of a second before Mark Henderson's voice sliced through the silence. She lied to all of us, he said, leaning forward in his chair, voice dripping with indignation. She snuck into this company under false pretenses, deceived her coworkers. And for what? A little corporate espionage? Lisa Monroe, sitting beside him, folded her arms and let out a short, incredulous laugh. Unbelievable, she muttered. I've never seen such a blatant betrayal. If this is how she plans to lead the company one day, then God help us all. Sophia kept her expression neutral, even as every muscle in her body tensed. She refused to let them rattle her. Jonathan Carter, her father, sat at his desk, fingers interlocked, his face unreadable. He had not spoken yet, had not even looked directly at her since she walked in. That, more than anything, made her uneasy. Richard Lawson, a senior board member and longtime ally of her father, adjusted his tie before turning to her. His voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man who had spent decades navigating boardrooms and legal battles. Sophia, let's be honest here. This, he gestured around the room, is highly irregular. You infiltrated your own company under a false identity, violating multiple internal policies. Do you understand how damaging this looks? Sophia met his gaze without flinching. What looks worse, me investigating or what I found? A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, crossed his face before he leaned back in his chair. And what, exactly, have you found? She took a steady breath. Corruption, embezzlement, abuse of power. I have proof of fraudulent transactions linked to Lisa Monroe. I have records of intimidation tactics used against employees who refuse to comply with Mark Henderson. I have evidence that this company is being manipulated from the inside, and that those responsible are sitting in this very room. Mark scoffed. This is absurd. Lisa shook her head, her voice dripping with disdain. And where exactly is this evidence, Sophia? Because all I see is a desperate attempt to cover up your own misconduct. Sophia took a step closer to the desk, finally turning her full attention to her father. Dad, she said, her voice softer now, more direct. You always told me that leadership isn't about power. It's about responsibility. If I'm going to inherit this company one day, I need to know the truth about what's happening inside it. Jonathan remained silent, his expression giving nothing away. Richard Lawson exhaled, shaking his head. Even if you have something, Sophia, none of it is admissible. You obtained it through unauthorized means. You expect us to take the word of an employee who never existed? Sophia's jaw clenched. She had anticipated pushback, but she hadn't expected it to come this quickly or this forcefully. Mark seized the moment. I think we've heard enough, he said smoothly. I propose an immediate suspension. Sophia Carter, he let the name hang in the air, as if savoring the power it gave him, has violated company policy in ways that warrant serious disciplinary action. Lisa nodded in agreement. There needs to be consequences for this. We can't have people thinking they can just infiltrate the company and undermine its leadership. Sophia turned to her father again, searching for something, some sign that he was on her side. But Jonathan remained still, his gaze locked on hers. Then, finally, he spoke. We're not making any decisions today. Mark's face twisted in frustration. With all due respect, sir, this is. Jonathan held up a hand, cutting him off. Enough. Silence fell over the room. He turned his gaze back to Sophia. You have 24 hours, he said, his voice firm but even. If you want to prove your claims, bring me irrefutable evidence. If you can't, you will step down from this company and never bring this up again. Sophia inhaled sharply. She had expected a fight. She had not expected it to come from her own father. Mark leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. He thought he had won. Lisa folded her arms, watching Sophia like a predator waiting for the final blow. Richard Lawson adjusted his cufflinks, looking entirely unbothered. Sophia's hands curled into fists at her sides. 24 hours. That was all she had. The air in Sophia's apartment was thick with tension. Ryan hunched over his laptop at the small dining table, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. Ethan paced near the window, phone in hand, occasionally glancing at Sophia, who sat with her arms crossed, eyes fixed on the screen. "We have something," Ryan muttered. Sophia leaned in. "What is it?" Ryan pointed to a transaction buried beneath layers of routine expenses. "This, a 7-figure transfer listed as operational costs. It was funneled through a company that doesn't actually exist, at least not in the way it's supposed to." Ethan frowned. "Lisa's shell company?" Ryan nodded. "It's registered under her name. But the money doesn't stay there. Look." He clicked a few more times, bringing up a second document. A significant portion of the funds were withdrawn under Mark Henderson's authorization. Sophia exhaled slowly. "That's our link. Direct financial involvement." Ethan nodded. "It's enough to expose them." But Sophia wasn't satisfied yet. "We need to make sure they can't worm their way out of this." "What else do we have?" Ryan scrolled further. "There's a pattern. These transactions happen right before major financial reports go public. It's like they're skimming off the top before anyone notices." Ethan crossed his arms. "And if we dig deeper?" Ryan hesitated. "Then we might find out they've been doing this a lot longer than we thought." Sophia knew they had to move fast. Mark and Lisa weren't just going to sit back and wait for their downfall. She grabbed her phone and started typing. "We need an emergency leadership meeting. Tomorrow morning. No prior notice." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You really think they'll just show up?" Sophia smirked. "They won't have a choice." She sent the invitation to every senior executive, every board member. Then, to ensure Mark and Lisa couldn't manipulate the narrative, she sent a copy of their financial misdeeds to a journalist she trusted, someone who had been waiting for a corporate scandal this big. "They'll know we're onto them," Ethan warned. Sophia nodded. "Good." Mark and Lisa would be scrambling now, and she wanted them to be desperate. The news hit them within an hour. Lisa was the first to react. She stormed into Richard Lawson's office, barely keeping her composure. "We have a problem." Richard leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I assumed as much." Lisa dropped a folder onto his desk. "She's calling a meeting, and she's involving the board." Richard skimmed the contents of the file. "What does she have?" Lisa's voice was tight, enough to make this a disaster. Mark entered moments later, his face pale but controlled. "We need to shut this down." Richard exhaled. "And how do you propose we do that?" Mark clenched his jaw. "We go on the offensive." Lisa nodded. "We get ahead of it. We discredit her before she can discredit us." Richard tapped his fingers on the desk. "Considering, you're asking me to risk my position to protect yours." Mark didn't hesitate. "If this blows up, it won't just be about us. The board will start digging. And they might find things that go beyond just Lisa and me." That got Richard's attention. After a long pause, he spoke. "Fine. But if anything goes wrong, Mark, you take the fall. I will not be dragged into this." Mark's fists clenched, but he nodded. Lisa exhaled sharply. "We still need a way to stop Sophia." Richard looked at her carefully. "Then I suggest you come up with something before tomorrow morning." That night, as Sophia reviewed her plan one last time, her phone buzzed. A distorted voice spoke through the line. "Be careful, they're planning something." The line went dead. Sophia's stomach twisted. Mark and Lisa weren't going down without a fight. The conference room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Every major executive, every senior board member of Carter Enterprises sat in their designated seats, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Jonathan Carter sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his face unreadable, hands folded in front of him. To his right, Richard Lawson leaned back slightly, observing, waiting. Across the table, Mark Henderson and Lisa Monroe sat stiffly, their eyes flickering between each other and the door. as if calculating an escape route. Then the door opened, and Sophia Carter stepped in. She was no longer wearing the plain uniform of a janitor. Gone was the quiet, unassuming Sophie Martin, who had walked the hallways unnoticed. In her place stood the true heir of Carter Enterprises, poised, confident, and prepared for war. Mark's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. Lisa's fingers tapped nervously against her notepad. Sophia walked toward the center of the room, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She met her father's gaze briefly, steady, unwavering, before turning to address the board. "I called this meeting," she began, her voice even, controlled, "because Carter Enterprises has a problem. A problem that has been growing for years. Right under your noses." She placed a USB drive on the table. "And today, I'm here to expose it." A murmur spread through the room. Sophia plugged the drive into the conference room's central display. The large screen on the wall flickered to life, revealing financial documents, transaction logs, and confidential emails. Ryan and Ethan had worked through the night to organize the data, ensuring every piece of evidence was airtight. And now, it was time to lay it all bare. She clicked to the first slide. "This is a financial record from 3 months ago," she said, pointing to a highlighted figure. "It shows a routine expense from our operations budget. But when cross-referenced with offshore banking data, we discovered that this money, over $2 million, was funneled into a shell corporation." She turned to Lisa, "A corporation owned by Lisa Monroe." A sharp gasp came from one of the board members. Lisa's face remained blank, but her grip on her pen tightened. Sophia clicked to the next slide. "And this isn't an isolated incident. We found multiple transfers, totaling over $15 million, all disguised as operational costs. The transactions were staggered, carefully hidden within legitimate expenses." She turned to Mark. "And then there's Mark Henderson." Mark stiffened. Sophia pressed play on an audio file. Mark's own voice filled the room. "Look, Jake, I can keep this off your record, but you're gonna have to show me that you're serious about staying here." Silence. Lisa's face went pale. Mark's fingers curled into fists. Sophia let the weight of the moment settle before speaking again. "This," she said, "is not just corruption. It's fraud. It's abuse of power. It's a systematic effort to siphon money from this company while silencing anyone who dares to speak up." The room erupted. Board members whispered frantically among themselves. A few exchanged glances, while others stared at the documents in front of them, as if processing the sheer scale of the deception. Then, Mark pushed back his chair and stood. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "She's presenting stolen data, illegally obtained records. None of this is admissible. None of this." Jonathan Carter raised a hand. Mark fell silent. Lisa, desperate, turned to the board. "We cannot seriously be entertaining this. She lied to all of us. She pretended to be someone else. We can't trust a word she's saying." Sophia folded her arms. "I lied to uncover the truth. You lied to steal from this company. Which do you think matters more?" Lisa had no answer. Richard Lawson, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. His tone was measured, deliberate. "I think we've seen enough." Jonathan Carter nodded, then reached into his folder, pulling out a stack of documents. He placed them on the table and pushed them toward Mark and Lisa. "This is the internal investigation report," he said. "It confirms everything Sophia just presented." Lisa's breath hitched. Jonathan exhaled slowly. Then, in a voice that left no room for argument, he spoke the words that sealed their fate. "Mark Henderson, Lisa Monroe, you are both terminated. Effective immediately." A stunned silence. Mark's face contorted with rage. "You can't." Jonathan's gaze turned sharp. "I can. And I have." Lisa clutched at the edge of the table, her entire body trembling. You can't do this." Jonathan's voice remained calm, but firm. "Security will escort you out." Lisa turned to Richard, but he merely adjusted his cufflinks and looked away. Mark, realizing there was no way out, clenched his jaw and turned to Sophia. "You think this is over?" His voice was low, dangerous. "You have no idea what you've started." Sophia met his gaze, unflinching. "Neither do you." As security entered the room, Mark and Lisa were led away. The door shut behind them with a final, resounding click. Sophia turned back to the board. Now, she said, let's talk about fixing this company. The moment the words left Jonathan Carter's mouth, the doors to the conference room swung open. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, their expressions impassive as they scanned the room. Mark Henderson, one of them announced, his voice steady but authoritative. You're under arrest for bribery, fraud, and abuse of power. A stunned silence filled the air. Mark shot up from his chair, his face turning red with rage. This is insane. You have no proof. Sophia didn't flinch as she met his furious gaze. We have more than enough. Lisa Monroe's chair scraped against the floor as she stood abruptly, eyes darting around as if searching for an exit. You can't just take him like this, she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. This is a misunderstanding. The officers ignored her. One of them pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Stepping toward Mark, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Mark jerked his arm away. You're making a mistake. Sophia folded her arms. No, Mark. The mistake was thinking you could get away with it. The officers moved in, and within moments, Mark's hands were locked in cuffs. His glare burned into Sophia as they led him toward the door. Lisa took a step back, her breathing shallow. Then the second set of officers entered. Lisa Monroe, one of them said, you are under investigation for embezzlement and financial misconduct. Her hands trembled as she looked to Richard Lawson, searching for help, but Richard simply smoothed his tie. Avoiding her gaze, Lisa turned to Jonathan. You're just going to let them do this to me? Jonathan, who had remained composed throughout the entire ordeal, finally spoke. You did this to yourself. Lisa opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked to the door, then back at the officers, as if weighing her options. Then she bolted. She barely made it 3 steps before security blocked her path. The officers moved in, taking her arms firmly but without force. Don't touch me, she hissed. But it was useless. The walls were closing in, and she knew it. As Lisa was escorted out, Richard Lawson let out a slow breath, his fingers drumming against the table. I suppose this is where you tell me I'm next, he said. Finally looking at Jonathan. Jonathan studied him for a moment. You covered for them, you protected them, but you were smart enough not to get your hands dirty. Sophia narrowed her eyes. That doesn't make him innocent. No, Jonathan admitted, but it does mean we can't charge him. Richard exhaled through his nose, then stood. I'll save you the trouble. Consider this my resignation. Sophia watched him go, a part of her unsatisfied. He was walking away with his reputation in ruins. But he wasn't in handcuffs. Not yet. The board members sat in stunned silence, still processing what had just happened. Then Jonathan turned to Sophia. Well, he said, I think it's time we discuss your future. For the first time, there was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty. Sophia had proven herself, and now, she was ready to lead. The days that followed were a whirlwind. With Mark and Lisa gone, Sophia wasted no time initiating sweeping changes within the company. Internal investigations were launched, safeguards were put in place, and employees who had been victims of corruption finally saw justice. Jake Parker got his job back. Maria and the janitorial staff received higher wages and better working conditions. And Ethan Brooks? He got a well-earned promotion. For the first time in a long time, Carter Enterprises felt like a place where people could work without fear. But just as Sophia allowed herself to breathe, her phone buzzed. A new email. No sender, no subject. She clicked it open. There was only one sentence. Mark and Lisa were just the beginning. Did you really think you'd won? Sophia's blood ran cold, because for the first time since this all began, she wasn't sure if she had. Power reveals character, but so does the absence of it. When given authority, some choose integrity, while others abuse their power in the shadows, until the light exposes them. Sophia's story proves that true leadership isn't about titles or wealth, but about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. So, what would you do if you uncovered corruption where you least expected it? Would you risk everything to expose the truth? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths for more eye-opening stories that challenge power and reveal hidden realities.